Shwmae a chroeso I Sgwrs, podlediad Consortiwm Canolbarth y De. Yn y podlediad hwn byddwch chi'n clywed y trafodaethau diweddara am bob math o bethau addysg. Hello and welcome to Sgwrs, the Central South Consortium podcast. In this podcast we'll bring you the very latest discussions on all things education.
Hello and welcome to another of the Literacy Team's podcasts. Today is an exciting opportunity for us to talk about all of the problems to do with writing, one of the most cognitively complex tasks we can ask our learners to do. My name is Emma Jackson-Phillips and I am Associate Advisor for Languages, Literacy and Communication, and I'm joined by
Gareth Rain, Head Teacher of St Peter's School in Cardiff.
Sian Ford, Leader of Literacy at Whitmore High in Barry.
Rhys Hughes, Head of the English Faculty at Avontaff High School in Merthyr Tydfil.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for joining us today to discuss this kind of pertinent topic. I wanted to kind of set up this kind of roundtable discussion by thinking about some key questions and some key problems that we have at the moment to do with the teaching of writing. I want us to think about, do we really teach writing, or do sometimes we maybe conflate the assigning of writing tasks with actually that explicit instruction? Are ideas about what constitutes effective writing universal, or does it vary between settings? Do the pupils know what constitutes effective writing? And also, I wanted us to discuss, are we missing the basic cornerstone of writing, the sentence level? Is it often dismissed as being perhaps too basic, and we're skipping over and trying to ask our pupils to write extended pieces too quickly? So I wanted to set some of those questions up first of all, so feel free to jump in if you have views on any of those questions.
So I just would like to go to the idea of, do we really teach writing? And I think certainly in a secondary perspective, I think there's that assumption that they've learnt a lot of the grammar and the not smaller elements, but sentence level elements in primary. And then, you know, I certainly think back to when I was doing my teacher training, we weren't taught how to teach writing. We were taught how to set interesting, challenging tasks, which actually is not the same thing. And setting an interesting task is great, but if the pupils haven't got the skills to be able to actually write an extended piece, then they're not going to be able to successfully manage to complete the task. I think what we often do is, you know, we'll discuss and we'll model and we'll talk about success criteria to the point where pupils can relay their own success criteria, but I'm not sure how much they actually understand what using varied sentences means. They just know it's something they're supposed to do. So I think when you mention the sentence level, and I know that with the comparative judgment, they've been working with the Writing Revolution. I've been reading the Writing Revolution book, and it really does, I think it could be really successful at starting right back at sentence level, building up to paragraphing, and then building those paragraphs up into full extended pieces of writing.
I think it's a Writing Revolution analogy, actually, where they mention starting with the roof, like in secondary schools, we are trying to build a house from the roof down rather than from the foundations up. Yeah. And I firmly agree with that. I feel like in secondary school settings, we focus on the complex. Our pupils will be able to tell us what an oxymoron is, or they will be able to tell us something more complicated, but then they wouldn't be able to answer a simple question like, what is a sentence? And I don't think as teachers we do focus on the groundwork, on the foundations enough.
And do you think, you mentioned a kind of assumption by secondary school teachers that maybe these things are taught in primary schools. Do you think there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of what secondary schools are aware has been taught in primary school? What do you think, Gareth?
So the trouble is not just in secondaries in terms of that idea of teaching from the roof down, but that goes all the way down to the youngest year groups within the primary school. So we jump into extended writing in year 1 and even in reception. So I've come from a school in the Vale of Glamorgan, St Joseph's School, where we looked at reading, writing, and how we were teaching children to read and write through structured, explicit teaching over around a 5-year period. And even though the main focus was really on those same ideas within reading, it moved on to writing within that time, more and more so. And when I came here then to St Peter's and chatted to them about how they were teaching both reading and writing, and they were saying that in the autumn term of reception, they're asking their children to write a postcard. And what was interesting about that is that the children actually weren't even writing words or forming letters correctly, and yet by October or November, they're asking them to write a postcard, because lots of the work that they'd been doing was around this idea of building up to an extended piece or the writing journey itself. So we stripped that right back and said, well, how can we possibly do that when the children are still trying to form Ds and Cs and so on? So that idea of explicit teaching of writing at the sentence level actually goes back even further in the primary level to the word and phrase and clause building up to sentences.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting, and it's almost comforting, but also disconcerting at the same time, that the issues that we're seeing, perhaps in terms of national expectations that we should be producing extended writing too soon, are kind of mirrored both in the primary setting and in the secondary setting. So I'd like to put some of our conversations here into a bit of context, because I know that we were lucky enough for all 3 of your settings to engage with the comparative judgment pilot. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about that. So in autumn 2020, Central South Consortium invited schools to take part in a pilot of comparative judgment. And comparative judgment is a means of assessing pupils' writings on against a huge national archive of pupils' writings on the same open-ended task and the same year group nationally. The assessment was judged collaboratively by teachers across the schools using comparative judgment, and every 10th judgment was a moderation judgment, where you compare the pupils' work against 2 other schools. So this historic data meant that schools in our region could receive standardised scores for their writing and writing ages. And obviously it's revealed some pretty stark data, which in light of the potential regression due to the pandemic means it's a really pressing topic. So some of those figures for us: out of the schools who took part, the average writing age for year 3 was 7 years and 2 months against a national average of 8 years. Out of the schools who took part, the average writing age for year 5 was 8 years and 5 months against a national average of 8 years and 8 months. Out of the schools who took part, the average writing age for the inherited year 7s for our secondary colleagues was 9 years 7 months against a national average of 10 years 1 month. So the national picture isn't aligned chronologically with pupils' ages anyway. So I'd really kind of like your reflections on that comparative judgment, as I know that you guys have been involved in it and undertaken it.
So at St Joseph's School, we'd actually been a no more marking customer a year prior to the pilot. So we had a year's worth of experience coming into this activity. And what we had found was really interesting across the school in St Joe's. So lots of the work that we had done, like I said, over a 5-year period, and actually more and more building up to when we actually entered the comparative judgment work with no more marking, had looked at the teaching of writing. Yet we still found that in particular year groups, we were behind the national averages. And of course, by national, we mean here sometimes international, because there are British schools abroad. But most of the customer base, it's around 90%, are in England. And we found that our year 1s, year 2s and year 3s were significantly behind the picture across mainly the schools in England, but also internationally. However, at St Joseph's, we found that in year 4, we were actually ahead of the national average, in year 5, slightly ahead, and in year 6, in line with. So what was really interesting about that for us was is this linked to the ways of teaching in the foundation phase, where perhaps it's more formal in year 1 and year 2 in England in how they're teaching writing? Was this particular to one school of St Joseph's? But also because of the curriculum that we had brought in a few years prior to entering into the work with No More Marking, we had been looking at the explicit teaching of writing, so structured exercises and scaffolding. And so had that work that we'd been doing helped our children by year 4, 5 and 6 to make progress? And where were we in comparison to maybe the Vale of Glamorgan, the region of the Central South Consortium and Wales? And it was almost frustrating to just have one school's data. I was really keen for others to get involved so that we knew what we were doing helping or hindering, or was it the same as the rest of the region? So it's now great to have lots of other schools involved.
That's so interesting that you should say that, because when I asked the question, I thought that you were going to discuss kind of your reflections on the data and what it told you. But it sounds as if actually being part of the comparative judgment allowed you to ask more questions than it actually answered, which is really, really interesting, because I think perhaps there's another level of work that needs to go into that in terms of the reasons for why we are kind of below the national expectations, the national average and the chronological ages for our pupils. Really, really interesting. I don't know whether Rhys and Sian, you want to talk about your reflections on being part of the comparative judgment.
What I took from the comparative judgment and what I felt was a real benefit was it gave my department food for thought. It encouraged dialogue amongst the staff about what good writing was. And I don't think we ever really took the time before to actually sit and discuss what constitutes good writing. And I felt like it was a really useful tool to promote that discussion. And also, when you join that trial, you become a part of a community, I suppose, of a school, of like-minded schools who are interested in what constitutes good writing. So it helped to solidify some of my own thoughts about maybe what our pupils, about what good writing was, and what maybe our pupils needed to do to improve their writing. So sorry, to summarise, I think it was a useful tool for my team to talk about good writing.
Did it reveal any discrepancies, you know, in terms of when you had those discussions with your team? Was it a kind of uniform idea of what effective writing is, or was it something that you guys had to kind of thrash out and arrive at that kind of definition of what we're looking for here, or what is expected of our young people?
I think some teachers will tend to deviate towards the path of creativity when it comes to the writing, whereas other teachers will veer down the path of organisation and accuracy. And really, I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So I think, like, if you ask me, I would focus a lot more on sentence structure, organisation, and those type of grammatical features would constitute good writing, whereas some teachers will focus more on the ideas and the content. But yes, like I said, I think the true path would lie somewhere in the middle. And the discussion, I think, culminated in that idea that you need both.
Just leading on from that, so with us, we were really similar in our department. We were having conversations about good writing, and you know, it is a really good debate to have, because as Rhys was saying, that, you know, there is that balance needed between having that accuracy and grammatical accuracy and a variety of sentence structures, and having some flair to engage the reader. But equally, if you can get that variety of sentence structures, that can actually help to create that flair anyway. And, you know, interesting vocabulary, you know, it all builds it. But I'm pleased to say we were pretty much of sort of the same thinking in our department. But I think one of the things that staff liked was the fact that comparative judgment allows us to sort of feel that we're trusted to make those judgments. You're not against a certain set of you know, curriculum levels that have been created, which actually sometimes the wording from one level to the next level is there's barely any change there, and it's not necessarily clear at all times what constitutes, you know, sometimes it'll say effective use or confident use, and that change in adjective in the marking grids isn't necessarily, you know, an effective way to mark, whereas this gave staff the opportunity to go with their gut, to go with what actually felt like the better writing in terms of looking at for accuracy and that flair. But yeah, I agree that I think it's somewhere down the middle. And if you haven't got the variety of sentence structures, you're not going to be able to have that flair, and the creativity won't flow as well. You know, one of the things we found massively was run-on sentences was a real issue. And you know, it's difficult to read something in an engaging way or to find that there's flair there when the sentence just continues, because the meaning gets lost. So I think that's something that we really found that's come out of it, is that perhaps where pupils are really excited to get their ideas down, or, you know, and maybe not stopping to take the time to think, but run-on sentences was one of the biggest issues that we had. Sorry, Emma.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely not alone in saying that, and you raise a very interesting point there in terms of some of the flaws of perhaps using mark schemes and descriptors to determine what constitutes effective writing, because sometimes those ideas are very arbitrary. It's very difficult to make them tangible to our pupils without examples. Thinking, going back to the question of whether it's kind of the mechanics of good writing and the technical accuracy and the sentence structure, and then also kind of thinking about whether it's creativity as well. I wanted to bring Gareth in here because I know that he's looked at kind of thinking about pupils' working memories and how actually the mechanics of writing and making sure that pupils are solid in those skills actually frees them up to be able to write about the content. So I just wanted to bring Gareth in there to give us his views.
Thanks, Emma. So working memory, as we know, is very limited. It's very small indeed, and more recent studies have shown that perhaps it's even smaller than we'd previously thought about 15 or 20 years ago. So generally, the kind of average working memory will hold about 4 bits of information. We used to think it was maybe sort of somewhere between 5 and 7, but we now think it's around 4. When children are writing, if they are trying to concentrate on having things from a success criteria or rubric like lively and adventurous language, and like you said, Sian, it's actually sometimes one person's lively and adventurous language is not the same as someone else's. What they're not doing then is maybe concentrating on the accuracy, so the full stops, the rest of the punctuation that they want to use, different types of sentences, complex sentences, simple sentences, even things like paragraphs. And what we can do through explicit teaching of scaffolded practice, deliberate practice of writing, is get to the stage where pupils are so good at those things, they become automatic. And so once we have achieved automaticity in those kind of skills, then they can free up their working memories to be able to think about, what do I know about this topic? So if we're asking children to write about the Vikings, they no longer have to concentrate on the structure of their sentence. They can think, what do I know about the Vikings? And so in doing so, the quality of the writing will be there in terms of accuracy because they've practiced it so much, but will also be there then in terms of the content itself. And so the more that we can create a curriculum that is based around content, really interesting and engaging content where pupils want to know more about the science or the history or the geography, and we have practiced in our LLC sessions, in our English sessions or our Welsh lessons, when we have practiced those skills and we have practiced how we write sentences that are interesting using techniques like the because, but and so, or practicing use of fronted adverbials or appositives or whatever it is that we practiced, also in history lessons and IT lessons and in science lessons, then we can put all that together. And that was something that in my previous school and in St. Peter's, we have really tried to focus on. We've tried to focus on the skills and the mechanics of writing and trying to get to it the stage where it's as automatic as it can be. So all of that working memory can focus on dragging information from long-term memory about what they know about the topic. So what do I know about geology and volcanoes? What do I know about the Vikings? What do I know about World War II? And then the writing almost takes care of itself.
Mm-hmm. So we're kind of getting to a stage then where we're not thinking about, is it the content or is it the sophisticated sentence structures? Because we're thinking about how the content can drive the writing and how the writing can drive the content. And I think that's a really kind of interesting question, because there are advocates for kind of teaching grammar explicitly independent of the content, and advocates for teaching grammar within the content and as part of that context. And I think it would be lovely to get to the stage where we all think of writing as something which is cross-domain, cross-phase, everybody's responsibility, and that the explicit teaching of writing is a powerful tool to develop subject and content knowledge and skills in general, not just thinking about writing in its own right. You mentioned there fronted adverbials. I don't think we can get away from the Twitter storm that is the fronted adverbial debate, and I really kind of want to touch upon this and to think about some of the kind of arguments and some of the debates that have surrounded this. So to put it in a little bit of context, on Twitter is an argument that we can get very far in life without knowing what a fronted adverbial is, and is there really a need to be teaching pupils what a fronted adverbial is explicitly as they do in England? So I really wanted to ask Sian here what you thought of this this debate.
I can understand to an extent, you know, some of the arguments that are made, but I think realistically it's more probably the term that sounds a lot more complicated than it is, and as such it's potentially frightens those that don't automatically know what that term means. When you actually look at what it is, it's not a particularly complicated sentence structure, and I do think it is really important that different sentence structures are taught, and I think that the earlier they're taught, you know, like you were saying, Gareth, about it provides them the opportunity to have automaticity with it. If they've learned it earlier and they're in a position to use a variety of sentence structures, their writing is going to be more varied, it's going to be more interesting, it's going to be more sophisticated. And, you know, from a secondary point of view, that in terms of, I know it's not all about exams, but at the end of the day, that's what pupils are measured on in terms of moving on with their own education or career. And it's not just about the exams, but if a pupil is able to write like an A-star pupil, for example, their examiner will treat them as an A-star pupil because they don't know who they are or what their kind of capabilities are, etc. So I think it's really important that we're giving all pupils the ability to be able to write in a sophisticated way. The term as well, I mean, it sounds confusing, but having the name for it allows us to actually teach it. It allows us as teachers and pupils to find examples in work, and when we're given feedback, it allows us to say, could this sentence be changed to a fronted adverbial? You know, I know not necessarily every sentence will need to be changed, but it's just to get pupils to think and to give clearer feedback. So sorry, Gareth, you were.
Yeah, thank you. One of the programs that we used in my previous school and in my current school is expressive writing. And we came to expressive writing after reading the work of Daisy Christodoulou, in which she says that expressive writing is the best writing program that she knows. So we made some contact with her and tried to find out a bit more about it, and then purchased it for my last school in about 2017. And upon first glance, expressive writing looks like a traditional grammar scheme and even looks a little bit boring, and you think, gosh, you know, what's so good about this then? But the more that you look at it, the more that actually the exercises are extremely well put together. They're so well written that the children both enjoy going through that program, and make huge gains very, very quickly. The progress made in their writing is fantastic. So one of the things that works so well about it, to build upon what Sian was saying then, is that yes, it does teach the names of different parts of speech, and it might teach you about writing, but actually it does so in such a subtle way that it actually tells you how the things work first. So for instance, one of the very first things that, in fact, it is the very first lesson that the children come across in the Expressive Writing 1 book, is the idea of a subject and a predicate. But they don't worry too much about those terms to start with. They just say, this is the part of the sentence that names, and we call this the subject. This is the part of the sentence that tells more, and we call this the predicate. And then they have multiple exercises right the way throughout the programme where they'll say, look at the part of the sentence that names. And so that's the important part. It's the idea of what it does, much more so even than the name of the term. And of course, what happens over multiple exercises and across many months is that the children then do remember the name because the concept is already in their mind. And so this is such a good way to teach aspects of syntax and grammar, is what it does first, rather than necessarily what it's called. And practicing using those terms, practicing using those ideas is much more important than the names. And then the names themselves will come, and they do come. And that's exactly what we found through the programme, which also then translated to really good writing across the curriculum, which is ultimately what we're aiming for.
Definitely. And I think a few really interesting things have come out from us discussing this fronted adverbial debate, particularly the idea of grammar may be causing a sense of fear in terms of the names and the terminology. And it's interesting, Gareth, that you mentioned that you know, there can be explicit instruction of grammatical terms without pupils in primary being too fearful or bogged down by the terminology, but actually getting to know what the concept itself means. And then Sian, your views in terms of giving something a name, actually allowing us to be able to teach it so that pupils understand what that concept is. And I wanted to bring Rhys in here in terms of thinking about the feedback that we give our pupils, because I know perhaps early on in my career that I was guilty of it, perhaps giving unhelpful feedback such as add more detail. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean anything to a pupil. You know, are you talking about adding more detail in terms of the way the sentence is structured? Are you talking about adding an A positive, or are you talking about adding more subject knowledge? And I think it's a really, really interesting question in terms of the way that we teach writing, because we can teach it explicitly, but we need to think about as well the feedback that we're giving our pupils in terms of how it moves them on.
Well, our quest is always to encourage our pupils to become better or more effective writers. If we were providing feedback, something more vague like vary your sentence structure, then pupils might find that that instruction more difficult to deal with than try to include a sentence with a fronted adverbial here and reminder of what a fronted adverbial is. Yeah, our quest as teachers, like I said, is to encourage pupils to become more expansive and more effective writers. And if we provide vague targets, then it becomes more difficult to do that.
Thank you very much. I wholeheartedly agree. And I also wanted us to think about, because I really don't want us to think about writing in isolation. I want us to think about how perhaps oral rehearsal can enhance writing and vice versa, and also the relationship between reading and writing, going perhaps more down the routes of pupils having enough to write about, pupils having enough stimulus, cultural capital, so that because we can perhaps they get to the stage where there is that automaticity and they can write really, really well, they can write really effective sentences. But I also want us to think about whether pupils have enough to write about.
So I really like the term cultural literacy, which is where these ideas really maybe originate with Hirsch and the core knowledge curriculum going right back to the 1980s and his book, Cultural Literacy, where we're saying that the children might have had great experiences with their family. They might have been to the theatre, they might have been to the beach, they might have been to the forest and so on. But we as a school need to try to give these experiences also, both in terms of actually really truly giving these experiences, taking the children in Wales to the Brecon Beacons, taking the children to Barry Island or Porthcawl or wherever we go, but also, like you said, through reading. So through those experiences of reading it through the ideas of others and through the eyes of others. And then to come back to your point about the oracy and the speaking and listening and so on aspects of it. An often quoted phrase is James Britton's 1970 quote about writing floating on a sea of talk. And that absolutely is true, of course. But equally, I think it's more of a symbiotic relationship than that. Equally, talk will sit on writing. So the better you are at writing, the better you are at structuring your sentences, the more that you've actually written down your ideas and tried to formulate, what do I know about this? What do I think about this? Whether it's an argument, whether it's, should we keep animals in zoos, or whether it's just purely, what do I know about particles in physics? When you're writing down your ideas sometimes, your thinking becomes better, which therefore leads to better ways of explaining things orally. So it goes back and forth. Writing does sit on a sea of talk, but equally, better talk will come from being able to write really well. So your thinking and your speaking will improve if your writing is good too.
Yeah, I just to build on that really, I think I use a lot of class discussion before we do a written task, but a lot of the time actually it's more to build cultural capital. Quite often it'll be a sharing of ideas, or we get into quite philosophical discussions, usually around a novel we're studying or something like that, because it can help pupils to be they can be sorry, the word I'm looking for is not there. It allows them to see different ideas that they might not see at home. And I do find that it can really help in terms of a cultural capital side, but I agree with what you're saying in terms of, Gareth, in terms of it doesn't always translate into the writing. And I've had some pupils who can really eloquently express their ideas verbally, but when they come to write them down, they don't know where to start, and they just really struggle to put those, they'll show a really good understanding orally, and then you read their work and think, is this the same child? And I think I need to as well, is perhaps use more written, written opportunities, and to develop that, putting those thoughts into writing before they jump from a discussion to the extended piece, and not just necessarily at the planning the planning phase, but potentially breaking it down into smaller chunks before they even start the planning.
Well, I think knowledge is certainly power when it comes to writing, because no matter how skilled as a writer you are, if you are asked to write about something you don't know about, then you will struggle to do it. Yeah. For instance, if you gave pupils a task about writing a description of a place that they visited or something like that, if you deliver that task to a pupil who doesn't travel very far, yeah, then they will struggle regardless of their writing capabilities. So I certainly think knowledge is power when it comes to writing.
Yeah, and I think I had a moment quite early on in my career where we were sort of looking at past papers, and one of the kind of cold tasks that I wanted to look at the pupils' performance in was a writing task on the Olympics, and I thought, oh gosh, that's a really good task. I think it's got quite a low floor and a high ceiling. I think all of the pupils will be able to access that, and it really showed my naivety when one young student came to me and said, well, I don't know what the Olympics are. I tried my best, but if that were the exam question, I know I wouldn't have enough. I wouldn't have enough to write about. I wouldn't have enough steam. And I thought, gosh, you have got a pupil here who's very capable, who is able to sentence structure sentences in a sophisticated way, who is very accurate, understands the mechanics of language, has a good vocabulary. But I need to do more as a practitioner to make sure that these pupils are having those experiences, and really kind of imploring them to read and to read as much as possible, and to give that exposure to those different texts. And the other thing would be that in our spoken language, as much as I try to be a good model of language for our young people, I know that perhaps I'm not using all of the varied sentence structures that I would expect or would hope or would teach explicitly to my pupils. So if they're not reading it, if I'm not modeling it in class, then I owe it to them to teach it explicitly, and also to give them opportunities to read it, you know, with as much exposure to different texts. I don't know whether anybody else has any views to contribute on that.
So writing is the most cognitively demanding task that we ask children to do. So if we are really hoping and aiming for children to become proficient, competent writers, then we have to give explicit practice in writing. And if we can do that alongside the development of their knowledge in all of the different areas of the curriculum, then we are most of the time going to achieve our aims. But if we try to jump straight into an extended piece, whether it's about the Olympics or whether it's just in response to a stimulus like a photograph or a painting or a piece of music, and they don't really know much about it, then they are going to struggle. So it's the two ideas running alongside each other that will allow them to take those ideas that they have maybe in their head or maybe that they can say onto the page. And so often, and I know that thinking back to when I was in school, this was the same for me, and for my son who's in his GCSE year now, this is the case. Orally, he's much better than he is on the page, and I was exactly the same. And sometimes that's not always the case for children, but very often it is. And that's because even those who sometimes do have the content knowledge just haven't had those experiences of the deliberate practice of fronting the writing, or everybody writes, or building up through those different activities that we talked about earlier, like because, but, and so. And if we don't give those alongside the content knowledge as well, then they're not going to be able to write those pieces. And one study that's from A-level students in Malta showed that children or students who had better writing skills did better at an equivalent to A-level in physics. So even in a subject like physics, where you might think it is all about what you know about the subject, actually, yet again, it came down to the quality of their writing. So we know this is the case all the way throughout the curriculum. We have to build up their content knowledge. We want them to know as much as they possibly can about as many wide and varied topics as they can, but they also have to be able to translate that to the page.
Thanks very much for those reflections, and I think it's bringing us quite nicely on to the question of where do we go from here. So I know Sian has some views on this as well.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say I agree with Gareth. I think it needs to be interwoven together. It can't be. I think grammar needs teaching explicitly, but it needs to be done so along with content, because what I've found is if you teach grammar as a separate thing, then you know the children might be able to complete that worksheet on apostrophes, for example, or you do a whole lesson on it and it's great and they've got it. By the next time you do a lesson or you ask them to do a piece of writing, they don't use them, because there's not that automaticity of, oh, this is, you know, getting used to using it in their writing or getting used to using it within tasks, different tasks. It just to them is something they do when they're working on apostrophes, and then some will carry it over, but many of them won't necessarily be able to carry that across. And I think if we can get a balance, and certainly I'll be looking in our school at whole school approaches, using some of the writing revolution approaches like you've mentioned, because, but, and so, and you know, simple things like appositives in order to teach, you know, for subjects to use them whilst teaching content as well, and to start pupils to develop arguments using those sentence structures and changing and playing with those sentence structures. I think that could be, and it has shown to be, really successful in a number of schools.
Would you like to add anything to that, Rhys, in terms of in terms of where we go from here, or to build on any of those points?
I feel that word automaticity keeps coming up. And if I was thinking about a pupil at the start of Key Stage 4, the perfect pupil at the start of Key Stage 4, what we would like our pupils to be able to do at the start of Key Stage 4, if they had automaticity in the basics of writing, the fundamentals of writing, then they would be far more successful at Key Stage 4. So from my perspective, Key Stage 3 then could be used to try to and Key Stage 2 could be used to try to make these skills automatic, so that when it comes to Key Stage 4, then it is all about showing what they know, rather than trying to firefight, I suppose, and keep trying to go over these skills at Key Stage 4.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there is a tendency for us to think about kind of papering over the cracks and dealing with these issues maybe too late. But I think what we've done today is to try to really strip it back, and think very reflectively about the way we teach writing, and lots of the different influences on that. So to conclude our kind of roundtable discussion, which has been very illuminating, open question then, in case anybody wants to add any extra points, or to discuss any texts that have resonated with us in terms of the teaching of writing. I know that we've mentioned a few, but it's always useful at the end of a podcast just to kind of reinforce those and to leave people with somewhere else to go in terms of their reading.
I just really quickly want to add onto Reese's point that I agree. I think Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 need to be working to build those foundations. And from my point of view, I think I want to work quite closely now with our feeder primaries, because I think if we can get a common approach, and a common approach can be agreed, then that would really help. And it would mean that we were far more in sync, and we would know what's been taught and where to lead on from. You know, in secondary and in primary, they would sort of know what the expectations are for secondary as well. So I think that would work well for us. Sorry.
I'd like to build on that as well, Sian and Reese. And I think for primaries, we should absolutely be your best friends. So if we can try and get those pupils ready for Year 7 in that way, so that they're coming up to, not even coming up to Key Stage 4, but coming up to Key Stage 3. And of course, in the new curriculum, there's supposed to be a seamless transition across all of these different phases. So there's no longer phases, but just one continuous journey of education. If we can do that, they're ready for that transition to high school, so that the children do know how to structure their sentences in a varied way, so that most importantly of all, they know how to structure a really good sentence, capital letters and full stops, which is very often, to go all the way back to our first question about the Year 7 data, what it showed us the children are not doing right now is structuring that simple sentence, or using a series of sentences to build up to a really good paragraph. If we can make sure that we absolutely send up 100% of our children to you, reading at a proficient level and being able to write in that way, then they're, to me, the best foundations that we could provide. So that, again, to come all the way back to your first questions, Emma, about do we jump into extended pieces too quickly? Absolutely we do. I went to a school in the US looking at the core knowledge curriculum before it was taken on in St. Joseph's School. And it was so interesting that when I went into a Year 3 classroom and asked if I could see their extended writing pieces, they said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, when you write stories or letters or non-chronological reports." And they showed me their writing books, and not one child in the class had written anything longer than a half-page paragraph in the whole year. And they said, "This is all we aim for by Year 3. Well, what was really interesting then was that every single student in the whole year, out of 60 pupils, could all write a really well-structured paragraph. So if we could do that by the end of Year 3 for all of our children, then Year 4 and 5 and 6 is really when the extended pieces can come. It's as if we're trying to get children to be able to perform pieces of music before they've practiced their scales or their fingering or their breathing techniques or whatever else. We're jumping in at the deep end when really we absolutely should be teaching the technique and the foundations. So if we can do that, getting them to come to you then, Sian and Reese, I think that then we'll truly will be achieving that continuum that we want, that you can then build on.
Absolutely. I think that's a really kind of nice message to end on, in terms of thinking about working collaboratively with our clusters and thinking about a common approach, because it's clear that lots of the problems seen in secondary are mirrored in primary, and I think starting this debate could be a really useful reflective platform for practitioners to think about their own approaches to writing and how we can have more of a common approach. So just lastly, to conclude then, any texts that have resonated with us in terms of the teaching of writing, or it may be something, a text which perhaps informs the teaching of writing. So it could be something in terms of our practice that we could maybe discuss. Sian, what do you think?
I've got a few that I could mention, but I know I've mentioned the writing revolution already, which is Hockman and Wexler. But I also would recommend, from a vocabulary perspective, Bringing Words to Life by Isabel Beck, McCune and Kukan. Alex Quigley's Closing the Vocabulary Gap is another good one, and a lot of that is quite heavily based on David Crystal's Spell It Out, which I can also say is a really interesting read, because that looks a lot at the history of language and how we've got to the language we've got today, and it informs a lot of looking at the etymology can really inform the teaching of it. And then finally, the other thing to mention that I didn't get a chance to mention before, but just this is a very old copy, but Alan Peate's 25 sentence structures. I don't know if Gareth, you might have come across this in a primary setting, but it can be a useful way to kind of simply introduce some different sentence types to pupils for their writing.
That's great, thank you very much.
Okay.
Any more recommended reads? It doesn't matter if we've already mentioned them. Let's get our last plugs in.
So not just necessarily about the teaching of writing itself, but books that have informed my ideas about how to teach writing, why teach writing, and then how that links across the curriculum. Are things like Daisy Christodoulou's 7 Myths About Education, Dan Willingham's Why Don't Students Like School? Also back to Daisy and Making Good Progress. These are where I think those original ideas back in 2015, 16 and 17, where they came from. And then some of the techniques in Teach Like a Champion, so Doug Lemov and his team, Teach Like a Champion, they work particularly well for the teaching of writing, especially those ideas of front the writing, and everybody writes and so on. And then back to the cultural literacy ideas, anything from E.D. Hirsch then, so going back to his 1980s books, Cultural Literacy Itself, or Why Knowledge Matters, they've all informed my original ideas, which have then gone on to things like the Writing Revolution and so on. And of course, like you said, Alex Quigley's the vocabulary gap and the reading gap.
Reading, yeah.
So yeah, lots of those same texts.
That's great, thank you very much. And it's really good to know that we're recommending texts here that bring together cognitive science. We've got texts in terms of the explicit teaching of grammar. We've got texts that talk about the cultural literacy. So all of the things that we've kind of touched upon and wanted to marry, we've got quite a nice bank of recommended reads there. Thank you so much for joining us today in order to discuss some of the problems with writing, and also to think about some of the solutions to writing. And it seems as if we've got quite similar ideas, and we're working closely together in terms of how we can address some of the issues that the comparative judgment pilot has highlighted. A quick plug from me in terms of literacy and Central South Consortium. If you could follow us on Twitter, that would be much appreciated. And please look at our professional learning events, which you can find on the Cronver website. They're regularly updated. There's something for everybody there, for all phases, all domains. And also keep an eye out for other professional learning opportunities to do with the explicit teaching of writing. Thank you very much, everybody.
Diolch am wrando ar y bennod hon o Sgwrs. Cofiwch ein dilyn ar Twitter a Facebook, tan ysgrifio ein sianel YouTube, ymuno yn cymunedau ar ein gwefan a darllen ein bwletin ysgolion wythnosol am y newyddion diweddaraf. Thanks for listening to this episode of Sgwrs. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube channel, join our online communities via our website, and read our weekly school bulletin for the latest news. Hwyl am y tro. Bye for now.